Today's topic is presidential roles. Now, often I'll refer to this as which hat is the president wearing? In other words, which role is he playing? It's a really good idea as we go through this chapter to see if you can find current, specific examples of our president performing each one of these roles. And I do mean specific. When, where, how. Everybody got that hint? Should help come exam time. The first role, of course, is the commander-in-chief. In reality, it seems as though the president has the most authority in this role than in any other. It's true that in 1973, Congress made a huge leap with the War Powers Resolution, trying to lessen this a bit, but the power still remains vast. Part of having the president in control of the military is because it's a tenet of democracy. Remember way back in the other chapters when we talked about the conditions of democracy. Now, of course, in the time of President Washington, the president was also the chief general. He was involved in the strategy and the battles, etc., and even Congress was pretty much involved in what was going to happen. Now, the president decides overall policy, and the Congress pretty much stays on the sidelines. But certainly the president is no longer thought of as a top general. With the commander-in-chief, remember he's the one in charge. He's the one that the CIA, the Navy SEALs, Special Ops, all that wonderful stuff, the covert operations that we hear about, they all report to the president. In our history, we've had over 125 times when the president has sent troops off our soil. Now, this is not declaring war, this is sending troops, part of the power of commander-in-chief. In domestic situations, troops have also been sent. Some examples, Emancipation Proclamation was done under this power, Japanese internment during World War II, and a National Emergency Act. It's really kind of interesting. When a national emergency is declared, there are a number, over 100, special laws that go into effect. But that's for another course. One of the second roles, or the second role we're going to talk about, notice the top hat, is the diplomatic leader. Now what we have here, of course, is it is the president who is the world leader as far as the rest of the country is concerned. The rest of the countries are concerned. It is he that gets to recognize foreign governments. It's he that is going to receive ministers and appoint and receive ambassadors. It's up to him to make and sign treaties. Now, of course, the treaties have to be okayed by the Senate. But in reality, this diplomatic role, this foreign and international relations role, does seem to be the least challenged sphere. As the diplomatic leader, really, we know what way Congress can control foreign affairs, and it's through money. That really makes a difference. The executive agreements are something that have been around for a long time, but they are becoming more and more powerful. Look at the picture. It really is a handshake between two leaders, so that they make the decision to give something a try, to set something up. This is a way to get around the Senate. It can do many things that treaties do, but is seen as a personal agreement. It can make us understand why personal interaction between our president and other leaders of other countries can be so crucial and really can be affected by personalities. When you think of this, I hope you can see how the military role of commander-in-chief is affected by this worldwide role of diplomatic leader. They do pretty much go hand in hand. The president, of course, is also our chief legislator, at least today. Now, this is a bit misleading because the president does not introduce legislation. That has to be done by a member of Congress. But he does propose a great deal and then gets a willing member of Congress to introduce the legislation. Now, most experts say this is something that President Washington would have thought was just a horrible thing to do. We can also see most of, or a great deal of, his role as chief legislator every year with the State of the Union address. Now again, he doesn't submit it specifically. He's going to have somebody else introduce it, but you will see legislative packages heading to Congress. It really is the estimate now, but that about 70% of what Congress does consider comes one way or another from the executive branch. Now remember, it may not be the executive himself, the president himself, but the office, the people who work for the president, they've become a major lobbying force in themselves. He does have a staff, and that staff's job is to try and influence legislators. And of course, the president can also use much of the power at his disposal, the prestige, the public appeal. He could offer to campaign for folks running for Congress. He could use the power of appointment to help get some of his proposals turned into introduced bills and then, of course, to be passed. The chief legislator's role also has this other little thing called executive privilege. Now, this is kind of a sideline, but what the executive privilege is the right to withhold information from Congress and from the courts, especially from congressional committees, when they're utilizing their oversight power and their investigatory power, especially when they're out to investigate. That should really tell you when executive privilege is called into play quite often. But today, the reason you see the picture of the Supreme Court on the slide is today the Supreme Court really has lessened the amount of times they'll uphold the executive privilege. If it is linked to national security, then executive privilege is more likely to be upheld by the Supreme Court. Of course, the president has the power of veto. Now, this is when it's a very public veto. He has to make a show of it, and he's going to refuse to sign it. He'll send it to Congress saying no, and they would have to override his veto with 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, and that can be difficult. But please remember, the veto threat can also be important. Now, that depends on how much Congress believes that the president is going to utilize the veto threat, and of course how comfortable Congress feels that they could override his veto. When the president uses the veto power, he usually is going to do it with a great deal of thought. If he's overridden, it could do one of two things. It could make him look really good as the savior, or it could say, wow, Congress isn't even listening to him. So the veto power does tend to be, especially in modern times, really thought about before it's utilized. The other way of vetoing, of course, is the idea that, we know in the Constitution that the president has 10 days to sign the bill. Well, if he doesn't, it still becomes law. But there's this other neat little thing called the pocket veto. Now, the key to the pocket veto is simply timing, because the pocket veto has to take place when Congress is not in session. So if Congress goes out of session, and the president doesn't sign it within 10 days, it's as though he put the bill in his pocket. And if Congress wanted that bill to be reconsidered, they'd have to pretty much start all over in the next session. Now, today, really, if a pocket veto takes place, it is probably much more due to either the ineptness or to the agreement of the congressional leaders. Remember all that information we talked about under Congress, where the calendar is so important, where the timing of the bill. Well, obviously, the timing of it is certainly going to be taken into consideration with the end of the session. In recent times, we've seen the Speaker keep the session of Congress open only with really nothing going on, but to make sure that the 10 days have gone by so the president would be unable to use this pocket veto. The other way of vetoing we've talked about, and some folks want, is the line item veto. Now, for a short time in the 1990s, Congress okayed it. However, in 1998, everybody writing that down, in 1998, it was declared unconstitutional. And the reasoning has been by the Supreme Court that it was a legislative power, that it was too much of a crossing over between the executive branch and the legislative. So the only way for the President of the United States to get a line item veto would be with a constitutional amendment. Now, that hasn't happened. Most governors in the United States have this power, not all, but most, and most presidents or prime ministers in many other democracies have the power, but we do not. Now, this is really something I hope you think about, because when a president receives a bill on his desk and he's trying to decide whether to veto it or not, he really has two choices. He either takes all of the bill, everything that's in it, all the good, all the bad, or he has to veto the whole thing. So imagine a bill like the budget or health care or whatever it might be. And here's 1,000-page long bill. The president likes all of it except one page. He either has to say, well, I got to put up with that, or he's got to veto the entire thing. Right now, when the bill comes to the president, it's an all or nothing choice in whether or not to veto. Under the chief legislator power, we also kind of see quite a bit of power that the president has with the budget. Now, we're going to talk about that more separately. But under here, he can move things around. And sometimes this fits better under the executive powers that we'll talk about in a minute. But even with legislation, I do want you to remember it's the executive branch that enforces the legislation, that enforces judicial rulings. So you can see that some legislative intent could be changed when it gets time to actually implement it. So it's very difficult to draw a line between every role and even between the branches many times. The roles of the president, all 7 that we're going to talk about, do run together. Under the chief legislator still is this wonderful thing called signing statements. Now, it's been in the news more recently, but signing statements have been around, I believe, since George Washington. I mean, it's been ages, okay? And what a signing statement is, picture the president, he's at the Oval Office and he's making a big deal about signing the bill, and he signs one letter of his name with the pen and he gives it to somebody, and he signs the next letter of his name with the pen and he gives it to somebody else. You get the picture. Well, after he signs the bill, think of a signing statement as being a PS. In other words, under his name, okay, now this is just for image sake, you would see him say, I'm signing this, but, and then he would write out his opinion about how certain parts of the bill might be implemented. He would usually bring up the idea of either something in the bill is unconstitutional in his opinion, or something in the bill could threaten national security. This is becoming increasingly common. However, it really is one of those deals where the president looks at something very big, says, okay, I'm going to sign this, but P.S., by the way, I'm not really going to enforce this, or I think this was unconstitutional, etc. All right? When you think of this, is it constitutional? Well, that's a really good question, because it hasn't been well challenged in the courts. There are a number of examples of presidential signing statements. Really, there's a couple on the screen here, but just Google them. You can find tons and tons and tons of them. Kind of think about it though. Is it something we should have? Guess what? I'm going to put part 2 of this lecture on another video.